The Arizona desert usually held its breath before sunrise, but that morning the silence was broken by a desperate sound. Mark Evans, a 62-year-old retired firefighter whose hands were calloused from years of fighting blazes, stood frozen in the doorway of his isolated cabin. He had lived alone for 5 years, finding solace in the rugged loneliness of the desert, accompanied only by his loyal Belgian Malinois. But today was different. Something was scratching at his heavy oak door, not with the aimless curiosity of a stray dog, but with a rhythmic, frantic urgency. When Mark finally threw the door open, the sight before him stopped his heart. There, trembling on his welcome mat, was a lion cub, not much bigger than a house cat, but unmistakably a mountain lion. Its left hind leg was clamped tightly in a rusty steel trap, the metal biting deep into the flesh. The cub was exhausted, its eyes clouded with pain and hunger, yet it looked straight at Mark, not with fury, but with a silent plea for help. The sheer audacity of the creature, waiting for him, trusting him, was overwhelming. In that moment, Mark knew his quiet life was over. He couldn't hold back the tears as he gently scooped the shivering animal into his arms, ignoring the potential danger, while his faithful dog stood silently by, sensing the gravity of the situation. Before we dive deeper into Mark and his unexpected companion's incredible journey, tell me, what time are you watching this, and from which city? I want to know just how far this story has traveled. If this story of unexpected compassion touched your heart, please tap that like button. It helps us share these tales of rescue and wildlife conservation with more people. And if you want to follow Mark's fight to save this creature, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a part of this emotional journey. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the labored breathing of the small creature on the rug. Mark Evans knelt beside the makeshift bed he had constructed from an old wool blanket, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he assessed the extent of the damage. The mountain lion cub, barely 8 weeks old, was huddled in a ball, its eyes tightly shut against the pain. The steel trap, a relic of a more ruthless era in the Arizona high country, had clamped down with brutal force on the cub's hind leg. Mark knew that every second counted. Infection was a silent, relentless killer in the wilderness, especially for an animal already weakened by cold and hunger. He reached for his first aid kit, a sturdy metal box he had kept from his firefighting days, filled with antiseptic wipes, bandages, and basic surgical tools. Axel, the Belgian Malinois, sat perfectly still just a few feet away, his intelligent eyes fixed intensely on the cub. The dog understood the gravity of the situation, his posture rigid, alert, and entirely focused. Mark took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline surging through his veins, a familiar feeling from his years of responding to emergencies, yet completely foreign in this context. He gently moved the cub's fur away from the wound, revealing the raw, swollen flesh. The metal jaws of the trap had lacerated the skin deeply, and though the bone didn't appear to be broken, the damage to the muscle tissue was severe. Mark muttered a quiet apology to the terrified animal, his voice raspy, before carefully applying an antiseptic solution. The cub winced, letting out a low, pathetic whine that seemed to resonate through the cabin walls. Mark winced with it, his heart aching at the sound. He knew that saving this creature meant breaking a fundamental rule he had lived by: never interfere with the natural order of the wild. But looking at the helpless, desperate eyes of the cub, he couldn't walk away. The internal conflict was agonizing. He had watched animals perish in wildfires, understanding that death was part of the ecosystem's cycle, but this was different. This cub was injured by a human-made device, a violation of the wild's own balance. That realization tipped the scales in Mark's mind. He was not just saving a lion, he was correcting a mistake. As he bandaged the leg with professional precision, his firefighting training kicking in, Axel shifted his position, letting out a soft grunt. The dog seemed to be asking if the creature was a threat. Mark looked at his loyal companion and shook his head slowly. "No, Axel. This one needs us." He spent the next hour cleaning the wound, his movements deliberate and focused, ignoring the stinging smell of antiseptic that filled the small cabin. Once the leg was securely wrapped, Mark realized the cub was dangerously dehydrated. He needed to get fluids into the small body, but the cub was terrified, shrinking away from any movement. Mark gently tried to coax the animal with a small dish of water mixed with electrolytes, but the cub just turned its head away, shivering violently. This was a critical moment. If the animal didn't eat or drink within the next 12 hours, the chance of survival would plummet drastically. Mark sat back on his heels, watching the small form on the rug, a deep sense of helplessness washing over him. The wilderness was unforgiving, and he was trying to play God in a world that didn't allow for mercy. Yet he refused to believe that this cub's story ended here on his rug in the middle of a cold Arizona night. Axel moved closer, sniffing the cub's head gently, a gesture of quiet acceptance. The dog's presence was a comfort, a reminder that Mark wasn't alone in this desperate gamble. The fire in the hearth was burning low, the shadows in the cabin lengthening, and the silent battle for the cub's life had just begun. Mark knew that he couldn't leave the cub alone, even for a moment. The fragility of its existence was terrifying. He shifted his sitting position, ignoring the ache in his knees, and continued to observe the animal's shallow breathing. The air in the cabin grew colder as the night deepened, and Mark added another log to the fire, the flames leaping up, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He looked over at Axel, who had now laid his head on his paws, his eyes still tracking every movement of the cub. The bond between the man and the dog was absolute, and now a third unpredictable element had entered their lives. Mark knew the coming days would be a test of endurance, a battle against time, and the unforgiving nature of a wild animal's survival instincts. He thought about his past, about the many lives he had tried to save and the few he had lost. This lion cub was just another life in a long line, yet it felt different. It was a bridge between the world he had left behind and the quiet, solitary life he had built here. He needed the cub to live, perhaps as much as the cub needed him to survive. The silent room was filled with unspoken questions and a desperate hope that clung to the thin air like smoke. The cub continued to struggle, its tiny body fighting against the trauma of the night. Mark finally stood up and walked to the kitchen area, grabbing a small dropper from the back of the cabinet. It was time to try a different approach. He knew it was risky, that forcing food or water could cause the cub to aspirate, but the risk of doing nothing was greater. As he approached the rug again, the cub let out another weak cry, a sound that seemed to plead for a reprieve from this overwhelming ordeal. Mark knelt down once more, holding the dropper filled with the electrolyte mixture, preparing himself for the battle ahead. He knew this night was far from over, and the sanctuary he had built was as fragile as the life in his hands. Weeks turned into months, and the small, terrified cub transformed into a sleek, powerful animal. The healing process had been slow, a grueling battle against infection and the trauma of the steel trap. But Rocco's resilience was a testament to the wild's capacity to endure. Mark Evans watched from the kitchen counter as the young mountain lion leaped onto the sturdy pine table, its movements fluid and impossibly quiet for a creature of its growing size. The ragged, trembling bundle of fur from that cold Arizona morning was gone, replaced by a sleek, muscular predator with eyes that held the sharp intelligence of the desert. Rocco had finally begun to eat tentatively at first, then with a voracious appetite that made Mark's meager grocery budget feel the strain. The trust, once non-existent, had slowly built layer by layer through shared meals and quiet afternoons by the fireplace. Mark's Belgian Malinois Axel had been instrumental in this transformation. The dog, a breed known for its protective instincts and high intelligence, had taken a surprisingly gentle approach with the cub. Instead of treating Rocco as a threat or prey, Axel treated him as a curious, somewhat reckless puppy. They would play fight on the rug, Rocco pinning Axel's ears with tiny claws, and Axel responding with playful nips and soft grunts. This unlikely companionship created a buffer between the wild animal and the human world, allowing Rocco to socialize without losing his edge. Mark often found himself observing them for hours, the old firefighter in him, realizing that this was not a normal domestic situation, but an experiment in bridging two completely different worlds. He had to be careful. Rocco was not a house cat, and his instincts were not dormant. One afternoon, Mark had forgotten to secure the pantry, and Rocco had deftly hooked a box of crackers, bringing it down with a swift swipe of his paw, displaying the predatory speed that lived beneath his playful demeanor. It was a stark reminder of the danger. Despite the playful moments, Mark understood that Rocco was still a wild creature. The animal would sometimes sit by the window for hours, staring out at the distant mountain peaks, his ears twitching at sounds that Mark could not hear. The call of the wild was still echoing, and Mark knew that his small cabin was merely a temporary respite. The internal dilemma intensified. He had saved Rocco, but now he faced the even harder task of ensuring the cub had a future. He could not keep him forever. The Arizona wildlife regulations were strict, and even if they weren't, Mark knew that a confined life was no life for a creature born to roam thousands of acres. He started taking Rocco for short walks around the cabin, letting him feel the desert sand beneath his paws, with Axel leading the way. The first few times, Rocco was terrified, hiding behind Mark's legs at the slightest sound of a crow, but gradually his confidence grew. He began to explore the edge of the scrubland, his nose twitching, taking in the sense of the vast landscape. Mark followed, watching the cub's instinctual behaviors emerge, the stalking of a lizard, the way his body flattened when a hawk circled overhead. The realization hit Mark with profound sadness. Rocco was already becoming part of the wild again, yet he was also tethered to him. The bond was a double-edged sword. He had fed him, healed him, and protected him, but true love meant knowing when to let go. He spent his evenings researching wildlife sanctuaries in the state, looking for a place where Rocco could transition slowly, where he wouldn't be alone. But the process was daunting, and the emotional toll of knowing their time together was running out weighed heavily on Mark's mind. The cabin, once a place of silent solitude, was now filled with the energy of two animals, a constant reminder of the life he was about to lose. Rocco would often sleep at the foot of Mark's bed, his breathing a rhythmic counterpoint to Axel's steady snores. A peaceful scene that belied the turbulent future that awaited them both. The Arizona sun continued to set over the mountains, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, a beautiful stark reminder of the wild world that Rocco was meant for. Mark would sit on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching Rocco play with a stick in the yard, and he would pray for the strength to do what was right, not what was easy. The sanctuary was fragile, built on trust and compassion, but the world outside was harsh and unforgiving. He knew that their story was far from over, and the hardest chapter was yet to be written. The bond they shared was unbreakable, but the laws of nature were even stronger. He began to see that Rocco's instinctual need for space was increasing, often pacing by the door when the wind blew from the direction of the canyon. Axel, too, seemed to sense this shift, his play sessions becoming shorter, replaced by a watchful, almost guard-like stance near the cub. Mark felt a knot in his stomach, a mixture of pride at seeing Rocco grow strong and the profound pain of impending loss. He realized that the time he had been granted was a gift, a chance to experience a deep, raw connection with a creature he was never meant to own. The quiet moments in the cabin with Rocco purring loudly while Axel rested his head on Mark's knee were becoming more frequent, as if the trio knew their time together was limited. Mark would look at his hands, still showing the remnants of the bandages he had applied, and he was struck by the irony. He had saved this animal, only to have to prepare him to leave. He knew that when the day came, the house would feel impossibly large and empty, and the silence of the Arizona desert would be deafening. But the wild was already calling, and Mark could not ignore its voice, for it was the same voice that had drawn him to this lonely place in the first place. It was during a quiet afternoon coffee that Brenda finally voiced the fear that had been haunting her. The Arizona sun was beating down on the porch of Mark Evans's cabin, casting long, stark shadows against the rugged landscape. Brenda, his nearest neighbor living 3 miles away, had dropped by under the pretense of borrowing a tool, but her eyes kept shifting toward the open cabin door. Axel, the Belgian Malinois, was lying in the shade, his ears perked, while Rocco, now a large, sleek young mountain lion, was sprawled out on the wooden planks nearby, basking in the warmth. Brenda's voice trembled slightly as she finally spoke, asking Mark if he truly understood the danger he was living with every single day. She had seen Rocco from a distance during her last visit, but seeing him up close, a fully functional predator lounging on a residential porch, was an entirely different experience. Brenda argued that this wasn't just about Mark's life. It was about Axel and even the safety of her own livestock miles away. She insisted that what Mark was doing wasn't compassion, it was madness, arguing that wild animals belonged in the wild, not in a living room regardless of how they were raised. Mark sat back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his coffee, his face a mask of calm determination. He countered that Rocco was not a typical lion, that the circumstances of his rescue and the months spent healing had forged a unique bond. Mark pointed out that Rocco was not hunting, not showing aggression toward Axel, and was effectively living as a companion animal. Brenda, however, refused to accept this, highlighting that instincts cannot be erased and that a mountain lion, no matter how tame, is still a wild animal with the power to kill in seconds. The argument grew tense, the silence of the desert amplifying their raised voices. Brenda accused Mark of being selfish, of jeopardizing his own safety and the safety of those around him for a feeling of companionship that was destined to end in tragedy. She warned him that the state wildlife authorities would take the animal away, or worse, destroy it if they ever found out. Mark stood up, walking to the edge of the porch, looking out toward the mountains where Rocco had come from. He felt the weight of Brenda's words, but he couldn't simply turn his back on a creature that had trusted him with its life. The tension between them was palpable, a stark contrast to the usual quiet camaraderie of their friendship. It was at that moment, when the debate was at its highest point, that a strange sound shattered the tranquility. The loud, sharp bang of a backfiring truck echoed from the distant main road, a sudden jarring noise that seemed to vibrate through the dry desert air. In an instant, the peaceful scene transformed. Rocco, who had been lounging in the sun, reacted with lightning speed. He bolted upright, his muscles taut and quivering, his eyes narrow and focused on the direction of the noise. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his being, a sound that Mark had never heard before. Rocco didn't look at Mark for reassurance. Instead, he stepped between Mark and the sound, his body hunched, his teeth bared in a display of primal aggression. Axel immediately sprang to his feet, barking loudly, mirroring Rocco's protective stance, but it was Rocco's display of dominance that paralyzed Brenda. She backed away slowly, her eyes wide with terror, recognizing in that moment the raw, untamed power she had been warning Mark about. The mountain lion was not playing. He was protecting his territory, and more importantly, he was protecting the human he considered his pack. Mark felt a sudden chill run down his spine as he realized the truth of Brenda's argument. Rocco was not a pet, he was a protector. And a protector can just as easily become a predator if the threat is perceived differently. The growling continued for several long seconds before the echo of the truck noise finally died away, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Rocco slowly relaxed his stance, his muscles loosening, but he remained alert, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. Mark turned to Brenda, whose face was pale and drawn. He didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes confirmed that the debate was over. The thin line between safety and danger had been violently crossed, and they both knew it. Brenda left shortly after the visit, ending without the borrowing of any tools, leaving Mark alone on the porch with his 2 companions. The air felt colder now, the sun doing little to warm the sudden realization of the precarious life he had constructed. He looked at Rocco, who had returned to his spot in the sun as if nothing had happened, and then at Axel, who was still alert. The trust was still there, but it was now tempered with a new, sober understanding of the reality they were living in. The silence that followed Brenda's departure felt heavy, laden with unspoken fears and the undeniable truth of the encounter. Mark sat down his coffee, now cold, and stared at the lion, the reality of the danger finally settling into his bones. He knew he had to talk to someone who understood the law. But the thought of losing Rocco was too painful to bear. He thought about calling Brenda back, apologizing, but his pride held him back. He felt torn, a man caught between the rules of civilization and the raw compassion he felt for this wild creature. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to creep toward the cabin, a reminder of the darkness that was slowly approaching. He watched Rocco, a creature of the night, now calm and peaceful, and wondered if he was just delaying the inevitable, if he was causing more harm than good by keeping him here. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, etched by the worry that he had tried so hard to hide. The cabin felt impossibly empty the morning Rocco didn't show up for his usual spot by the fire. Mark Evans woke to a silence that felt oppressive, a stark contrast to the usual morning routine of Rocco's playful pounces and Axel's quiet, watchful gaze. He immediately knew something was wrong. The mountain lion cub, now a fast-growing adolescent, had never missed a meal, let alone a morning cuddle session. Mark hurried to the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs, to find the back door slightly ajar, the heavy latch malfunctioning in the dry desert wind. He stepped out onto the porch, calling Rocco's name, his voice swallowed instantly by the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona desert. Axel stood beside him, his nose working overtime, sensing his master's rising panic. There were no tracks on the hard-packed dirt of the yard, just the faint scent of sagebrush and the distant mocking call of a raven. Mark realized with a sinking feeling that Rocco had finally given in to the call of the wild, and now he was alone in a world he was only partially prepared for. He rushed back inside to grab his sturdy hiking boots and jacket, ignoring the cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. This was the moment he had feared since the first day he brought the injured cub into his home. He checked the time. It was already 7 in the morning, and the desert heat would be unbearable in just a few hours. He needed to find Rocco before the sun reached its zenith. Mark grabbed his rifle not to harm the animal, but for protection against other predators, and headed out with Axel firmly at his heels. The search began along the edge of the wash, where Rocco often played, but the sandy ground revealed nothing. Every shadow looked like a crouching lion, every rustle of the wind like a soft growl. Mark felt a suffocating pressure in his chest, a fear that was intimately familiar, echoing the paralyzing helplessness he had felt years ago when a flash fire had trapped his own family in their home. The memory was agonizing, a vivid flashback to the moment he realized he couldn't save them, to the shattering loss that had led him to this isolated life in the desert. He had tried to bury that pain, to find peace in the silence of nature. But now, history seemed to be repeating itself in a cruel, distorted way. He couldn't lose another life that depended on him. He stumbled over the rough terrain, his eyes scanning the horizon, calling out Rocco's name until his throat was raw. Axel was his only guide, moving ahead with a purpose, his tail twitching as he caught subtle scents on the wind. The dog was his anchor in this unfolding nightmare. Hours passed, and the sun rose higher, baking the desert floor and turning the air into a shimmering haze of heat. Mark was exhausted, his water bottle long empty, but he refused to stop, driven by a desperate, irrational hope. He began to imagine Rocco injured again, perhaps trapped in another device or prey to a larger predator. The scenarios playing in his mind were worse than any fire he had ever fought. He stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a weathered saguaro cactus, the sweat stinging his eyes. He felt his knees buckle, the emotional and physical toll finally bringing him to his knees. He bowed his head, a broken man in the middle of a vast, indifferent landscape, asking for a sign, a miracle, anything to bring his companion back. Axel nudged his hand, a soft whine escaping the dog's throat, his eyes filled with a shared concern. The The dog's touch was a lifeline, pulling Mark back from the brink of total despair. He stood up shakily and followed Axel as the dog began to move faster, his demeanor changing from searcher to locator. Axel was heading toward the steep cliffs of the canyon, a treacherous area that Rocco had only visited once before. Mark knew that if Rocco was there, the danger was immense. The heat was now blistering, a physical weight pushing down on them, but the fear of losing Rocco was stronger than the heat, stronger than his own exhaustion. He pushed forward, his focus entirely on the dog, trusting Axel's instincts more than his own. The silence of the desert was broken only by the sound of their heavy breathing and the crunch of gravel under their boots. Mark's mind was a chaotic blur of fear and determination, a battle to keep the crushing weight of his past from completely overwhelming him. The terrain became more difficult, with loose rocks and steep inclines challenging his weakened state. He thought of the times Rocco had watched him from the porch, the way he would tilt his head as if trying to understand the human world. Had Mark done the right thing by bringing him in? Had he only delayed the inevitable, making the final separation harder? The questions haunted him, a relentless torrent of self-doubt. Yet he continued, fueled by a love that was deeper than he had realized. Axel stopped suddenly, his body tense, his gaze fixed on a rocky outcrop ahead. Mark scanned the area, his heart stalling, the fear transforming into a sharp, desperate hope. He saw a flash of tan fur, a familiar shape blending into the shadows of the rocks. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like Rocco, sitting perfectly still, looking down at the desert floor below. Mark's voice caught in his throat, a mix of relief and terror. If it was Rocco, he was safe, but the journey to get to him was far from over. He reached for his rifle, ensuring it was secure, and continued to move forward, his eyes never leaving the shape in the rocks. The landscape seemed to hold its breath, the heat shimmering in the distance, a brutal backdrop to this fragile reunion. Mark knew that whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. The bond he shared with the lion was now officially tested, the thin line between love and loss exposed for what it was, a raw, emotional gamble against the odds. Just as Mark was about to give up hope in the dense brush, a familiar low growl echoed behind him. He spun around, rifle raised, only to see Rocco standing there, not with aggression, but with an intensity in his gaze that was almost human. The young mountain lion had emerged from the shadows of the rocky outcrop, his coat covered in dust, his muscular body vibrating with an unspoken urgency. Axel stood, paralyzed, his usual protective instinct replaced by a cautious curiosity as he looked from Mark to the lion. Rocco let out another low rumble, then turned and began to trot purposefully toward the steeper, more treacherous part of the canyon, a path Mark had never taken known only to the most experienced hikers and the local wildlife. Without a word, Mark followed, his heart pounding in his chest, driven by a desperate, intuitive trust in the creature he had raised. The air was thick with the scent of dry pine and heat, and the sun was a relentless force beating down on them. Rocco moved with an agility that seemed to defy the rugged terrain, pausing only occasionally to look back, ensuring Mark was still trailing behind. The dog, Axel, kept pace, his intelligence allowing him to understand the gravity of this silent, guided trek. They navigated narrow ledges and dense thickets, the terrain becoming increasingly hostile. Rocco was leading them toward a part of the canyon that was virtually unreachable without proper equipment, but the lion seemed to know every hidden path and crevice. Mark's lungs burned, his muscles screamed in protest, but the fear for Rocco had transformed into a focused determination. They were moving deeper into the wild heart of Arizona, a place where civilization felt like a distant, irrelevant memory. The sheer scale of the landscape was humbling, a vast, silent witness to their perilous journey. Rocco finally slowed his pace, walking with a deliberate slow motion, his eyes fixed on a dense patch of juniper bushes ahead. As they approached, the scent of blood and fear suddenly cut through the arid air, overriding the natural aroma of the desert. Rocco stopped, abruptly lying down in the sand and looking intensely at the bushes. Axel began to whine softly, stepping closer to Mark's side, his fur standing on end. Mark moved cautiously toward the bushes, his hand gripping his rifle, every sense on high alert. Through the thick branches he saw a man, his legs twisted awkwardly in a narrow crevice between two large boulders. The stranger was pale, unconscious, and obviously severely injured, his backpack lying several feet away. It was a horrific sight, a stark reminder of the harsh reality of the wilderness. Mark immediately rushed to the man, checking his pulse. It was weak, but steady. He quickly assessed the injuries: a broken leg, severe dehydration, and signs of shock. The man had clearly been trapped for days, his life hanging by a thread. Mark knew he had to act fast. He retrieved his first aid kit from his own pack, thankful for his past training as a firefighter, and began to administer basic medical care, calling out for any sign of consciousness. Rocco remained perfectly still, watching from the edge of the clearing, his predatory gaze transformed into something strangely protective. The lion seemed to understand that this was a situation requiring silence and patience. Mark worked efficiently, stabilizing the man's leg and forcing water into his mouth, his mind racing with the logistics of rescue in such a remote location. He realized with a surge of gratitude that without Rocco's guidance this man would have surely perished unseen and alone. The intelligence and loyalty the lion had displayed was beyond anything Mark had ever witnessed in any animal, wild or domestic. He looked at Rocco, who now stood up and began to pace gently around the perimeter of the clearing, his presence acting as a silent guardian over the injured man. The realization that Rocco was no longer just a rescued cub, but a fully realized predator with the ability to reason and protect, struck Mark with profound clarity. He understood then, with a devastating sense of certainty, that Rocco belonged here in this harsh, unforgiving, and beautiful world. The wild had taken its own and molded him, and Mark had merely been a temporary steward of his life. The rescue was not just a testament to Rocco's intelligence, but to the intricate symbiotic relationship that existed between all living things. Mark finished bandaging the man, knowing he had to find a way to get help, but he couldn't leave them alone. Axel sat beside the injured man, his presence a comfort, while Rocco continued to guard the area, a silent, powerful guardian of the desert. The sun continued to climb higher, but for the first time in hours, the fear was replaced by a strange, quiet sense of purpose. A realization that the wild had not only taken Rocco back, but had also taught Mark a lesson about the true nature of compassion. He knew that the man's survival depended on immediate medical attention, but he also realized that Rocco was the key to unlocking the mysteries of the canyon. He spent the next hour examining the area, recognizing landmarks that Rocco had led him through, mapping out a potential route for a rescue team. The lion was now resting in the shade, his eyes closed, yet his ears still twitching at the slightest sound, a constant sentinel. Axel, too, seemed to accept his role, watching the injured man with a calm, focused gaze. Mark felt a profound respect for the animal he had tried so hard to tame, realizing that true strength lay not in control, but in understanding and respecting the inherent power of the wild. He knew the coming hours would be the most difficult, but he felt prepared, his fear replaced by a quiet, unwavering resolve to bring both the man and the lion to safety in their own respective ways. The journey to the stranger had been one of desperate pursuit, but the journey back would be one of profound understanding, a testament to the fact that the wild and the human could coexist, if only for a fleeting moment, in the middle of a desert canyon. The arrival of Officer Miller in his official truck signaled the end of the quiet life Mark had built. The dust, kicked up by the heavy tires, hadn't even settled before the stern-faced wildlife officer stepped out, his gaze instantly locked on the large, sleek mountain lion lounging near the cabin door. Mark stood on his porch, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden railing, while Axel, the Belgian Malinois, began a low, uneasy growl beside him. Officer Miller didn't waste time with pleasantries, immediately producing a clipboard and demanding to know how long the wild animal had been kept on the property. The conversation quickly deteriorated into a tense confrontation with Miller, citing state regulations prohibiting the unauthorized keeping of dangerous wildlife, emphasizing the potential threat to the community and the legal consequences Mark tried to explain the circumstances of the rescue, the months of rehabilitation, and the profound bond they had formed, arguing that Rocco was not a threat but a part of their unconventional family. Miller, however, was unmoved by the emotional narrative, focusing strictly on the law and the safety protocols that required the immediate removal and likely euthanasia of an habituated predator. The argument became a desperate battle for Rocco's life, with Mark pleading for an alternative, a sanctuary, a chance for the lion to live. He argued that Rocco had proven his intelligence and lack of aggression, even citing the recent rescue of the hiker. Miller acknowledged the unique situation but remained steadfast in his duty, explaining that the risk was too high, that a habituated animal is fundamentally different from a truly wild one. The fear of losing Rocco transformed into a raw, painful desperation, with Mark realizing that his attempts to correct a human mistake had only created a new, complex problem. Axel sensed the tension, moving closer to Mark and pushing his nose against his hand, his eyes filled with worry. Rocco, sensing the hostility from the stranger, had stood up and was watching Miller with an intense, cautious gaze, his muscles taut and ready. Mark knew that any sudden move could trigger a fatal reaction, and he had to calm both the officer and the lion. He began to slowly walk down the porch steps, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, while speaking in a low, soothing tone to Rocco. He managed to convince Miller to allow him to secure Rocco in the large, reinforced shed he had modified for the lion, buying some time to find a solution. The process of moving Rocco was heartbreakingly slow, a test of trust that Mark wasn't sure the lion would pass in this high-stress moment. Finally, Rocco entered the shed, and Mark locked the heavy door, the sound of the metal latch echoing like a final verdict. Officer Miller then turned to Mark, his voice softer but firm, explaining that he would give Mark 48 hours to coordinate with a legitimate wildlife rehabilitation center, but if that failed, he would have to proceed with the mandated protocol. The departure of the truck left a heavy, suffocating silence behind a stark contrast to the life they had known just hours before. Mark sat on the porch, his head in his hands, the weight of the situation crushing him. He had fought the fire, he had fought the desert, but now he was fighting a system that did not understand the language of love and unconventional rescue. Axel rested his head on Mark's knee, his tail giving a single sad thump against the wood. Mark looked at the shed knowing that Rocco was inside, confused and frightened, and he felt a profound sense of failure. He had promised to protect the lion, and now he was faced with the devastating possibility of being the one to witness his end. He knew he couldn't just sit there. The 48 hours would pass faster than he could imagine. He went into the cabin, pulling out his old phone, the one he rarely used, and began making calls. The frustration grew as he was transferred from one department to another, the bureaucracy of the state proving to be as unyielding as the Arizona sun. Each conversation was a desperate plea, each refusal a hammer blow to his hope. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery orange and deep purple, a beautiful, stark reminder of the time that was slipping away. He looked out the window at the shed, the silhouette of the lion visible against the darkening sky, and he knew that the final choice would be the hardest one he would ever have to make. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison both for him and for the animal he had tried to save. He sat alone in the dark, the fire dead in the hearth, listening to the silence, praying for a miracle that seemed further away than ever. He thought about Rocco, wondering if the lion understood why he had been locked away, if he felt betrayed after all the trust they had built. The pain was unbearable, a physical ache that seemed to emanate from his chest. He knew that if he failed, he would never be able to forgive himself for bringing Rocco into his life, only to witness his destruction. The night was cold, and the desert wind seemed to whisper threats, a reminder of the harsh world that lay just outside his door. He paced the floor, his mind racing, searching for any possible way out, any loophole in the regulations, any person who might listen. But the silence remained unbroken, a testament to the lonely battle he was fighting. The day of departure arrived with a heavy mist covering the desert floor. Mark Evans moved with a mechanical precision, his heart too numb to process the imminent farewell. Rocco, sensing the shift in routine, sat quietly in the reinforced shed, his golden eyes tracking Mark's every movement through the small viewing window. Axel, the Belgian Malinois, paced nervously on the porch, sensing the emotional storm brewing within his master. The drive to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was silent, the rugged Arizona landscape passing by in a blur of saguaros and red rock. Mark kept his eyes on the road, fearing that looking at the large mountain lion through the rearview mirror would break his resolve. He had spent the last 2 days meticulously preparing for this moment, ensuring Rocco had everything he needed for the transition. When they arrived at the center, the dedicated staff was waiting to take over their professional yet empathetic manner, providing a small measure of comfort to Mark. The moment of parting was not filled with dramatic gestures, but with a raw, agonizing silence. Mark opened the transport crate, and Rocco stepped out, his powerful body moving with a graceful caution. He looked at Mark, his head tilting slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had shared. Mark knelt down, offering his hand for one last time, his voice choked with emotion as he whispered a final goodbye to the creature that had taught him more about life than any human ever had. Rocco nudged his hand gently with his cold nose before turning toward the vast open enclosure, his instinctive curiosity immediately drawn to the scent of the wild land. Mark watched as the mountain lion disappeared into the dense brush, his heart feeling as though it were being torn from his chest. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the facility emphasizing the profound loss he was experiencing. Axel remained steadfast by his side, his presence a silent anchor in the turbulent sea of emotions. The journey back to the cabin was a haunting echo of the drive there, the silence in the truck now absolute. When Mark stepped onto his porch, the cabin felt impossibly vast and empty. The fireplace was cold, the rug where Rocco used to sleep was bare, and the silence was deafening. He realized that his life had been irrevocably altered, that the companionship he had fought so hard for was gone, leaving behind only memories and a profound sense of purpose. He sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the mountains, the same view that had once represented his solitude, now a reminder of the wild world Rocco was finally part of. Mark understood that true love was not about possessing, but about respecting the inherent freedom of another living being. He had learned that the wild was not something to be conquered or tamed, but something to be cherished and protected. His experience with Rocco had awakened a new passion within him, a desire to contribute to the preservation of these magnificent creatures and their natural habitats. He knew that the cabin would never be the same, but he also knew that he had done the right thing, giving Rocco the chance to live the life he was truly meant for. The desert air felt different now, a mixture of profound sadness and newfound hope, and as the first star appeared in the twilight sky, Mark Evans felt a quiet, unwavering peace settle over his soul, knowing that he had served as a guardian of the dawn, and now the dawn was safe in the wild. He began to plan for the future, thinking about how he could use his skills and his home to help other animals in need, turning his lonely cabin into a place of healing and sanctuary. Axel nudged his hand, and Mark looked down at his loyal dog, realizing that they were still a team ready for whatever the future held. He would continue to fight for the wild, to advocate for the conservation of the land he had come to love, and he knew that Rocco would always be a part of his story, a symbol of the untamed spirit of the desert. The silence of the cabin was no longer oppressive but full of promise, and the quiet knowledge that he had honored the life of the wild, and in doing so, he had found his own purpose. The journey was over, but the story of the guardian and the lion had left an indelible mark on the desert and on his heart.